What's up? This is the 15 stages of chess progression. Let's get into things. My name is Kai. I am your YouTuber for today. I'm 23 years old. I studied finance and CS at Wharton. I am an adventure photographer, had previous hedge fund experience, and I've played competitive chess since 6th grade. My peak ratings are 1900 USCF, which is in the United States. Online, I am rated 2260 bullet, 2181 bullets, 2208 rapid, and I've played over 10,000 online games. So I know quite a bit about chess. I'm also really big into LeetCode. I've solved over 1,000 problems, and I play Catan. I'm rated 2000 ELO in two-player Catan, which is around top 1,000 in the world. We will cover these progression stages in this video. I separated this into 3 parts: beginner, intermediate, advanced. Let's just get into things. You can just look at it right here. Beginner stage. So if you're just starting out chess, there are some things that you have to learn right away, which is the board. It's an 8x8 board, 64 pieces, black and white squares. There's the pawn, knight, bishop, queen, king, rook, and you learn how these pieces move. You don't know what they exactly do. You just know, okay, they go into this diagonal, go into this vertical, this horizontal, or in an L shape, like for the knight. You also learn other special rules such as castling and en passant. En passant really isn't that important early stage, but it's always good to know what it is. You also understand what checkmate means, which is basically when the king is underneath check and there's no legal move to either stop that check, block that check, or move out of check. And that is what concludes the game. When you first start out, you understand, okay, I know where the pieces are, I know how to set up this board, and I have to get to this end result of putting my opponent in a checkmate position. You also learn draws, what draws are, if there's a stalemate, if there's not enough pieces to win the game, other edge cases like that. But the final goal in every chess game is to checkmate the opponent. And after that, you then start to learn space and board awareness. Oftentimes beginners are basically taught, hey, always focus on controlling the center. There are strong squares, there are weak squares. You want to bring your pieces active, and they're most active in the center. But you don't really understand what that actually means. When I first started to learn chess back in 6th grade, we were taught that, if you put a bishop in the middle of the board, it can control around 13 squares, right? 7 on its main diagonal and 6 on the other diagonal. But if you were to put that bishop directly in the corner, it can only control 7 squares. If you put a knight in the center, it can control 8 squares. But if you put a knight in the corner, it controls only 2 squares. For the rook, it doesn't really matter. For the queen, it matters a little bit as well. You understand that pieces can move to more squares when they're in the center. And from there, you can deduce that if you have your pieces in the middle, they can go to your opponent's side of the board much faster, and you can create more opportunities for yourself. So that's where the intuition for controlling the center comes from. From there, you're also thinking about, okay, if I want to get my pieces towards the center, I also want to block my opponent from putting his pieces towards the center. So that's where pawns come into play. You learn about pawn e4, pawn d4, pawn d5, pawn e5. Putting your pawns towards the center gives you more control over squares, as well as blocking your opponent from taking control of these squares. You're also getting a just an introductory view on how to position your pieces. You learn that the ideal squares for the knight would be like f3, c3, f6, c6. Ideal squares for the bishop would be f4, c4, c5, f5. And you want pawns on e4, d4, or d5, e5. So now that you've understand what the center is and why we want to put our pieces in the center, we then start to come up with our first opening moves. So when I learned chess, we were going to build our optimal opening. Like, where do we want all of our pieces to go? Pawn d4, pawn e4, bishop c4, bishop f4, knight f3, knight c3. All my pieces and minor pieces are towards the center. You want to develop your queen. So let's say queen e2, queen d2, and you want to castle, either king side or queen side. And then you bring your rooks into play on e1 and d1. So if this is your goal, to bring all the pieces out here, you then play through openings as black and white. You go through pawn e4, black plays pawn e5, white plays knight f3, black plays knight c6, and you're just going back and forth of controlling the center and developing your pieces. You also start to learn that castling is good. And why is castling good? From what I've said previously, because pieces in the center can move a lot more like flexible. By putting your king towards the corner or towards the side, you're able to better protect that piece, better protect your king. So you learn that castling is good, and you also learn about tempo or tempi, which is, I think it just means a move, right? You learn about saving tempi. Do not move the same piece repeatedly. If you go knight f3 and then knight back to g1, you just wasted 2 moves and you repeated the same position, except that your opponent is just 2 moves ahead. You learn basic movement when you're learning your first opening. After that, you start to learn exchanges, taking pieces, taking back pieces, and this leads to simple calculation methods of saying, okay, if I play pawn e4 and my opponent plays pawn d5, if I take on d5, black can take with the queen on d5. So you learn about piece imbalances. Okay, let's say I have a rook, a knight, a bishop on my pawn. Can my opponent take this pawn? Well, okay, my opponent has a rook, another rook, a pawn, and a bishop. Okay, 4 outweighs 3, so they can take the piece and they win in after the sequence of moves. So the simple calculation is just simple back and forth. You're counting the number of attackers and defenders, and you're thinking about, okay, I have undefended pieces here. How do I defend this piece so that black cannot take back? You're also thinking about, if I move my knight to this square, can black take this piece? And you start to think about, okay, they have a knight and a bishop, they control these squares, I'm looking out for these threats, how do I avoid these threats? And now you're building up your intuition of how to play and navigating the opening to early middle game stage with these simple calculation moves. Now, your final stage of a beginner is understanding basic tactics. There's so many tactics, so many different terms and definitions, but the main ones that you should learn about are forks, pins, and skewers. A knight forks the queen and the king with check, and you take the queen later, so you win a piece there. You're able to pin, let's say, the knight to the queen. You're able to pin the knight to the king with your bishop. When we're playing these moves like e4, e5, develop, and you play bishop b5 to go into the Ruy Lopez to pin the knight to the king, you learn about these different types of pins and how they limit your opponent's repertoire of moves. You're pinning the knight. The knight cannot move because black will sacrifice this piece later on. You learn about skewers, attacking stronger pieces, and when the stronger piece has to move, you're able to take the weaker piece that's behind it. That's what a skewer is. At this point, when I started playing, I was also in 6th grade, 7th grade, and you're grinding out chess exercises every day. You're playing these puzzles online, on these books. You're going on leechess.org, you're going on chess.com, you're just going through beginner tactic puzzles. You're also getting introduced to other tactics called zugzwang, sacrificing the piece, going for hanging pieces. There's so many different definitions and names for this chess jargon, but overall, basic tactics is recognizing opportunities and solving these 1, 2, or 3 move sequences to capitalize on this opportunity and then go into a better position. Whether that better position is through a material imbalance or through a positional imbalance. But positional imbalances come later when you're in intermediate. So for a beginner, it's mainly material imbalances. Now that you've been playing chess, it's been about a year since you've started playing chess. And you've reached the intermediate stage. You understood how to play chess. You've been playing a few games here and there, but somehow you're just still getting crushed. And you're thinking to yourself, hey, I'm not hanging my pieces as much anymore. I'm protecting all my pieces, but I just somehow end up getting crushed through this 10 move tactic that I did not see coming. How do I learn? How do I improve? How do I stop my opponent from just taking control of the entire board and crushing me, or my opponent breaking down my pawn structure and crushing me there? How do I stop this? You're at the intermediate stage. And when you're at the intermediate stage, your tactics improve a lot. Instead of going for 1, 2, 3 move tactic sequences. You're going for much longer term ideas. These ideas are sometimes really hard to calculate. Like they can go on for 10 moves, they can go on for 9 moves. But because of your repeated tactic solving, you're able to build up the pattern recognition. So one example is the Greek gift sacrifice. You start to learn the nuances of, okay, this is when the bishop sacrifice will work out. This pawn structure or if the knight is out on f6, it wouldn't work as well because black can get his pieces to defend much faster. And you start building up this intuition of, okay, I think I can pursue this idea. I think I can pursue this tactic. Let's look more deeply into this. Other examples would be the Marshall attack for black in the Roy Lopez. I love playing the Marshall attack, but you start to gain an intuition of, okay, I could bring my queen out, go for the check. White has a bad pawn structure, or white cannot get knight to d2 to f1 or whatever, or the queen cannot get there in time. So I'm able to bring out my pieces and justify this pawn sacrifice. And this comes after playing games over and over and over and over again and recognizing I have these things checked out. I have the pawn structure checked out. I have my minor pieces in play. I can swing my queen over. My king is safe from getting checked or from in-between moves. And that's when you start building up this tactical pattern recognition. And that's a really cool thing to do because it seems as though instead of directly calculating these moves, it just comes to you. You start to feel the chess where you start to understand, okay, I have a really good idea about this. Let's pursue this on further. Around this time, as an intermediate player, you're also learning basic checkmate patterns, or I'd say basic to intermediate checkmate patterns. You're learning about back rank mates, ladder mates, moving the rooks up and forth. You're learning about smothered mates, sacrificing, let's say black has a king on h8 and a rook on f8, and you want to go for a smothered mate with knight on f7. So you sacrifice your queen on g8. Black has to take with the rook. You go knight f7, checkmate. You're also thinking about how do you deliver checkmate in the most precise manner without your opponent being able to intervene by blocking with a piece. How do you block out your opponent's pieces on the board? How do you stop them from, preventing your checkmate pattern? So you're also thinking about, okay, how do I draw the black king out of its castle king side? Do I go for a sacrifice on pawn f7, on pawn h7? How do I crack down on my opponent's position? So you're also thinking about mating nets. You're thinking about getting your minor pieces into play and just setting up for 1-2 move sequences. You're setting up the positions that lend itself to more tactics. That goes with the same thing with what I've said previously of recognizing tactical awareness, and checkmate pattern awareness is honestly the same thing. You're also looking at positional fundamentals. As an intermediate player, you don't know position fundamentals that well. You understand that it's always good to control the open files. You don't want to get back ranked. Double isolated pawns are not good because they're very easy to be taken advantage of later in the future. You're learning about pawn islands, and you're also starting to learn micromanagement. You're starting to learn, okay, maybe I should close up my pawn structure. Maybe I should take things a lot slower and just micromanage my pieces, move my light squared bishop to a slightly better square so I can later prep for this pawn push in the future. My knight is sort of off to the side. How do I make these 3-4 moves to bring it closer towards the center? You're starting to think about the optimal squares on the board and thinking about how do I bring my pieces to this desired position. You're not necessarily making tactical moves. You're not trying to win pieces. You're just micromanaging your own side of the board and keeping an eye out for what your opponent could be doing. You're keeping an eye out, okay, my opponent can open up the position, and am I ready to counter my opponent's attack or opening up the position? My opponent will also want to micromanage and move their pieces around. Can I reach to my desired position before they can reach their desired position? You're starting to think about these different positional fundamentals. Number 9 is pawn structure. Pawn structure is arguably the most important thing in chess, in my opinion, simply because if you are an intermediate to advanced player, a lot of the times these games boil down to pawn endgames or simply winning a pawn and just maintaining that edge throughout the game. You're thinking about your isolated pawn structures, your doubled pawn structures. You're thinking about, if I have 4 pawns but they're on 3 files and I go against my opponent who has 3 pawns on 3 files, can I really force a pawn break and promote my pawn? In this example of 4 pawns versus 3 pawns on the same amount of files, you understand that it's really hard to get for that. It's really hard to get that pawn break. You start reading books, and I actually have these 3 books shown here. Chess Structures, A Grandmaster Guide by Mauricio Flores Rios, Pawn Structure Chess by Andrew Sotis, The Power of Pawns by Jorg Miquel. These books I highly, highly recommend, especially the one in the middle, the Pawn Structure Chess book, or Chess Pawn Structure book. It really provides the nuance of middle game to end game conversions and how to play the middle game so that you have the most optimal pawn structure in the future and find ways of yielding the greatest likelihood of winning this game by the very tiniest of margins. I think around this point when I started learning pawn structure, it was about a year or 2 years in. You're now tying all the different stages of the chess game: the opening, the early middle game, late middle game, end game. You understand that, okay, this whole time it was about pawn structure. It was about controlling the center with pawns. It's about creating open files by forcing pawn exchanges. It's about controlling, I don't know, like let's say going for a pawn push on the king's side and just breaking down your opponent's pieces and going for double isolated pawns. It all boils down to pawn structure. And this, I think, is the most important stage that separates the intermediate player and the advanced player, because the advanced player is able to take this pawn structure and convert it to a winning game later on, despite having the same amount of pieces on the board with the opponent, despite having no material imbalance. They're able to win due to the pawn structure itself. The final stage for intermediate players is opening, understanding, and middle game plans. Around this stage, you're starting to understand, okay, I like playing tactically. I like playing the Sicilian as black. I like playing the dragon. I like playing the Roy Lopez. I like fianchettoing my bishop early game. I like the King's Indian. You start to have a preference for what types of chess openings you like to do, and then you go really deep into that. As the beginner, you're only memorizing the first 10 moves of any opening, but as an intermediate player, you're not memorizing. You're understanding the first 10 moves plus the 10 moves after that. You're understanding the first 20 moves of your favorite opening. You're understanding the different nuances of, if I move this pawn first before I move this bishop, what happens? You understand the tempi that you save by micromanaging your pieces. It starts to become second nature for you, and your brain starts to go on autopilot when you're playing through openings that you've played many, many times again. So for me, my favorite openings are, I play a multitude of openings, but Gioco Pianissimo. I don't play the Roy Lopez as much, but I want to learn the Roy Lopez. Queen Pawn, Queen's Gambit, the Italian game. I play the English sometimes, and as black, you start to learn, okay, the 2 knights defense against the Scotch. You start to learn how to play the mainline Slav, the Moran, the Sicilian, E6 Sicilian, Sicilian Dragon, French defense. And that's what you're thinking about, okay, if my opponent plays the French defense, I want to go for the Tarrasch, I want to go for the exchange, I want to go play these different types of openings. But now you're understanding the pawn structure, the middle game, positional awareness, how to move your pieces to the desired structures in all these different openings, and you're able to then sort of blend openings together in a way. You start to blend ideas, and that is really trippy. But now you're just understanding general pattern recognition across all different stages of the game. You're recognizing that Like you recognizing that you can go from point A to point B. Let's say you go into the early middle game and you want to go for these different types of structures in your late middle game. And once you get into a different position, you're understanding, oh wait, I've seen this position before through this different type of opening sequence, through this other type of game that I've played in the past. All these moves, all the different variations that come out of that start popping up in your head because you've seen these positions before, you've played these games before, but there's a slight little difference here and there. You then start to understand the nuance of little bits and pieces to your middle game and how to improve from there. Okay, hopefully you're still watching this. I might have rambled a lot, but if you're still watching, please like and subscribe. Would really appreciate that. But yes, now let's get into the advanced chess progression stages. King and pawn endgames are, I think, the purest as well as the hardest things to understand in chess. Pawn structure was fun in the intermediate stage of your chess progression because you're playing with different minor pieces. You're tying in all the pieces and forcing yourself a win in the endgame later. But king and pawn endgames are probably, they're the most precise move sequences. There's no extra flair to it. There's no like, oh, I can drop my knight in here and go for a fork later and I'm able to checkmate by sacrificing this and this. No, this is literally, how do I promote my pawn before my opponent promotes their pawn? How do I block out the black king from forcing the position into a stalemate? You learn opposition, you learn triangulation, you start to think about pawn races. If I get this pawn race here and my opponent gets their pawn promoted as well, how do I check my opponent in a way where I can skewer the opponent's king to their freshly promoted queen? How do I convert this seemingly like a draw into a winning game? So it's super nuanced, super difficult. Right now, you're also starting to read Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, probably one of the most dense chess books out there with so much theory, so much endgame theory, and your brain is just getting pummeled. It's getting destroyed at this point because it feels so boring. It looks so boring at first when you're seeing an endgame, but you start to understand, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this than just king and pawns. Like there's so you have to experience it to understand what I'm doing or to understand what I'm telling you about, but it is so freaking difficult this stage. 12 is long-term positional theory. This sort of ties back in with pawn structure and understanding the pawn structure throughout your opening, middle game to end game. Around this point, you're understanding the purpose of micromanagement moves in the early game, and you start to understand, oh my gosh, Magnus Carlsen did this move in the Gioco Pianissimo on move 30. He did this to set himself up for move 70 later in the future. During this time, I also recommend looking into Wilhelm Steinitz. He is arguably the first world chess champion who pioneered positional chess theory. Before then, chess was a very flamboyant game, I'd say. It's a very stellar game where you go for crazy tactics, you go for crazy sacrifices, like, oh my gosh, like this opponent won because of these 10 moves and they were played so well. But Steinitz was able to play closed off positions and navigate this ambiguity of, I don't know who's really winning, but how do I get a little plus 0.2 edge here? How do I go for a little edge there? And he was able to distill chess into very minute micromanaged moves that created strong strategic plans that were then able to crush the opponent's slowing like an anaconda. At this stage, I just recommend looking into Wilhelm Steinitz. Also look into Mikhail Tal games. He's just able to play seemingly losing, according to the computer, losing positions where he's down by 1 or down by 0.7. But because he understands these crazy positional theories, he's able to force tactics that arise later. And he's able to win, despite, according to the computer, he's like down by a little thing. Hopefully you understand that. Hopefully I'm not confusing you guys much. Also, the next advanced stage is deep calculation and visualization. Right now, you're just tripping balls on chess. You're thinking about chess all the time. When you leave the board, if you're playing an over-the-board game, you're thinking about chess in your brain. You're able to play all these different moves in your brain, and you start to gain this incredible spatial awareness over the chessboard. The chessboard is literally molded with your mind. You think in chess. You think moves in chess. You start to calculate life decisions using chess ways of thinking. You start to prune, I don't know, like you go through like 5 candidate moves, you go through a bunch of different trees and branches of variations. You're pruning. And you're adopting this into your daily life. You're recognizing patterns, and you're saying, okay, hey, I've recognized this pattern before. I don't need to dedicate as much memory or compute in my brain to this position because I've analyzed this position so many times already in the past. If I get to this position, I know I can win. I know I can go on from there. This deep calculation and pruning and just developing the intuition for the game is what differentiates you from the intermediate player and the advanced player, which is you, because you're able to save on the time spent calculating. You're able to save on the memory in your head, how much RAM in your brain that you have to use to contain all these different boards and variations in your head. So now you're playing optimally from a health standpoint. You're able to save your energy and crush your opponent in the end game where your opponent is a lot more tired. So that is what the advanced player is good at, just saving energy, time management, and crushing your opponent later in the future, because your opponent will then start to make their own mistakes, despite it being a draw or a 0.0 evaluation right now. You're also learning these very niche, specific technical endgames. I learned a little bit of this, like the Lucena and Philidor rook pawn endgame positions, but like even me, despite being a 2260 online bullet, I still struggle with endgames. Yeah, like there's nothing much for me to add here except that there's just so much nuance to the game. Or you're looking at knight pawn endgames, bishop pawn endgames, opposite colored bishop pawn endgames, and there's just so many niche endgames, and you're just thinking to yourself like, oh my gosh, there's so much strategy here. Your brain is just getting destroyed at this point. And it gets pretty mind-numbing, to be honest, just to understand each little edge case of each little endgame. You learn that a pawn on the edges functions differently in an endgame compared to pawns on the B and G file or the C and F or the center squares. Like, there's so much nuance to this. The final stage of your chess progression is self-realization, as well as, I guess, becoming a fan of chess. So you're probably, watching the Chess Network, going through ChessBase, going through your games, looking at famous people's games in the past, and just trying to understand how they play their game. And you're also like successfully predicting the next move in many games that you see online. Of like, oh, I think AlphaZero is going to do this, or I think Lele Chess is going to do this. Oh wait, the computer figured out a different move. Why was that? And then you start to think about it. You say, oh wait, no, I understand it. I understand now. You're in this constant, let's say, cycle. You're in a cycle where you're able to predict a move, and when that move is made, that reinforces you to find the best move again. It's like reinforcement learning in a way, but like, you're human, you're not the machine, you're not the CPU, but it's your own reinforcement learning. You're also thinking about like, okay, chess is great and all, but in the end, it's just a game, right? It's just a game. There's so much more to life than just playing chess. You understand that chess is not the only way to, it's not the chess way of thinking is not the only system to apply in life, because life is not fully deterministic. It's not a game of complete information. When you're an intermediate player, chess is helping you a lot in your life decisions because you're able to make the best moves in life. You're able to, let's say, manage your time better. You're able to manage your studying better. But when you're an advanced player, you understand that chess is not all there is to life. You know, there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of random chance. In a way, poker is a better game. And I think that's when a lot of chess players move to poker. Yeah, that is my ramble on the 15 stages of chess from beginner to intermediate to advanced. My name is Kai. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too long or took too much of your time or that I was too confusing. This was all done in one take. I am rated 2260 online and I want to get back into chess. But yeah, hopefully you took something from this video and make sure to like and subscribe. Peace.